Well, good day, class. Welcome to all of you. I'd like to especially say hi and welcome to Cameron with a K, to Sukwin Joth, to Trenton, to Joseph, to Rylan, to Cameron with a C, to Mario, to Raymond, to Jack, to Addison, and hello, of course, to Faith, to Isabella, to Isaiah, and to Brandon. Now, this is after our last video about the crucifixion. I said the story is not complete, it's unfinished. And indeed, here comes the rest of it, the resurrection. Now, before we get into the story, it's the account itself, I need to make two notes concerning things that will pop up in our story. Number one, talking about Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers had a great deal of responsibility. When they were given a task, if they failed to execute it, oftentimes and many times, the penalty for that was being executed, being put to death. And in today's account, excuse me, we're going to see angels at work as well and see how they fulfill their role, as the scripture tells, as messengers. Well, we left it. Jesus had breathed his last. He had said, "It is finished." The victory triumph, the victory call. And he gave up the ghost and he died. And now, due to the fact that it was the Passover Sabbath and Jews could not have dead bodies out in public, they had to get his body off the cross. The Jews did not allow dead bodies to hang, and the beginning of the Passover Sabbath was just 3 hours away. So there was no time to lose in getting his body down off the cross and getting it buried. Now, this seems very cruel to us today, but the Roman soldiers had a way of hastening death. Now, crucifixion on a cross normally took several days. It was a slow, torturous way of dying, but they had ways of speeding it up, and one was to break the legs of the criminal up on the cross. And the breaking of the legs would cause blood loss, and especially if you get the femoral artery, and it would cause death much more quickly. And so the soldiers came, and they were breaking the legs of the two thieves on the cross. But when they came to Jesus, he appeared to be dead. And so they did not break his legs. But just to be sure, just to check, one of the soldiers took a spear and thrust it into his side. And water and blood flowed out of the wound. And they knew that Jesus was dead. They did not have to break the legs. And that was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy in the fact that none of his bones were broken. Well, while this is happening, some of the ladies that were there at the cross were watching. They were full of despair. They had no idea why this was going on, but they were going to stay there to the end. These include Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and several other women. And so now comes the work of getting the body down off the cross. And two people stepped up to be helpful there. Both of them were rather surprising. One of them was a man named Joseph from Arimathea, and he was a rich man, and he had a tomb, some people call it a sepulcher, that was nearby. And so he and a second man named Nicodemus worked at getting the body down off the cross. Now, Nicodemus, you may remember from John chapter 3. He's one of the rulers, one of the Sanhedrin, actually, and he came to Jesus by night. And this is where we get God so loved the world, John 3:16. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus when he says this, and evidently to this point, Nicodemus had been a secret follower of Jesus, but now he steps forward, and so all could see that he's a friend and disciple of Jesus. And so the men gently lowered the body of Jesus, and they carried it to the tomb. Now, the Jews had some burial customs that they went through. They would take the dead body, the corpse, and they would wrap strips of linen cloth around it, and they would intersperse, and there's some oils and ointments to help the body to smell a little bit better as it goes about its decay. And so this new tomb of Joseph, which was nearby, had never been used, a used tomb. And so they cleaned the body of Jesus. They wound it with strips of white linen cloth saturated with ointment and spices of myrrh and aloes. And after they had the body wrapped, they took a linen cloth, a napkin, and put on top and slightly around the head, as was the Jewish custom for burial. Now, this tomb of Joseph, they took the body there, they laid it in there, and there is a large stone slab outside the entrance to close it up. And so after they had placed the body of Jesus there, they rolled the huge stone slab in front of the entrance to block it off. Now comes something rather strange. The enemies of Jesus, who evidently remembered the words of Jesus better than his disciples did, they were worried about what would happen, what the disciples would do, because they remembered the words of Jesus, after 3 days I will rise again. And so what they did was they went to Pilate, who must be getting tired of them by now on this day, and they told Pilate his disciples will probably go at night and steal his body and hide it and tell everyone that he is risen from the dead. And Pilate said, okay, I'll give you 2 soldiers, you can guard the tomb. Now, I've always thought that to be strange, to be guarding the place where the dead people are. But anyway, that's what they did. Now, fast forward. Sunday morning, very early. Still dark. The sun hasn't come up yet. The wind will come later. Inside the tomb, the most wonderful thing that has ever happened in the history of mankind took place. Jesus Christ arose from the dead. Death could not hold him. He went right through his grave clothes, and as he did, they just collapsed like a balloon. No disorder in there. And he went out of the tomb, passed right through the rock. Now we'll see that again later. And so he arose from the dead. He had become sin for us. He had paid the price, and now he's rising in triumph. And so as the day began to dawn, there was a great earthquake that happened there. It must not have been too widespread, but the soldiers felt it certainly, and they jumped to attention. They were wondering what was going on, and they were terrified by it, and they fell on the ground in a dead faint. To a Roman soldier, this was dereliction of duty, and it was not a good thing for them. It was worthy of death. And so, as Jesus arose, he came forth. He came right through the rock. Now, we'll see that ability again a little bit later. Jesus stood up. He removed the napkin, folded it neatly, came out of the tomb. He had won the victory. He had conquered sin, Satan, death, and the grave, and all the enemies of God were defeated. And in power, resurrection power, and glory, he came forth. A dazzling, beautiful angel appeared from heaven. After Jesus came out, he broke the seal and then rolled it back, and then he sat on the huge rock door. Now, let's go back to the soldiers. As soon as they recovered from their fright, they noticed what had happened, of course, and fearing for their lives, they went back to Jerusalem and told the religious leaders what had happened. Now, the religious leaders bribed them, paid them money to tell a lie. So the soldiers told people, while we slept, his disciples stole the body away. Well, that doesn't make much sense, because Roman soldiers sleeping on duty, that's worthy of death. Plus, if you're sleeping, how do you know what's going on? How can you tell that the disciples stole the body away? And if you're soldiers, why didn't you stop it? So there are great big holes in that story that they were told to tell. Well, after that happened, just before dawn, just before daylight, 3 women came to the tomb. They were going to pay their respects. Today we bring flowers oftentimes to honor and commemorate a loved one that has died. And back then they anointed the body with spices, and that was their custom. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and these women, as they were coming to the tomb, the sun was just barely getting ready to peak up, but they had some problems. What are we going to do about the stone? They said, we can't roll it away. And the Roman soldiers, we'll never get to see the body of Jesus. But they kept, but they kept trying, and they finally got in sight, the top of the ridge, and they got in sight and it looked different. In the early morning light, they couldn't see things quite as clearly as they could later, but it looked as if the huge stone had been rolled away. Now, of course, it had been, but they didn't know that. And now they're coming into sight of it, and as they drew closer, indeed, they could hardly believe their eyes. The stone was rolled away. What in the world could it mean? Well, Mary Magdalene ran back to tell Peter that the tomb had been opened. The other women went closer, and they saw that the body of the Lord was gone. The tomb was empty. They're very puzzled about this. They can't wrap their head around this. The thoughts are spinning. The thoughts are not making sense to them. And suddenly an angel appeared before them, clothed in a shining robe, and they were terrified. And then the angel asked them a question that resonates through the ages to this day. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and don't be afraid. Don't you remember that he told you when he was in Galilee that he must die, but that he would rise again the third day? Oh, yeah, now they remember. The angel went on, go your way, tell the disciples, and he mentions Peter by name. Tell the disciples and Peter not to be sad, not to grieve and mourn anymore, because Jesus is alive. He has risen from the dead. You will get to see him, for he will go before you into Galilee. Well, this is a different story than what they were expecting. They were filled with joy, obviously, but they're probably trembling from excitement and awe and maybe adrenaline. The women hurried from the tomb and headed back to Jerusalem. The story, what a story they had to tell. And they found the disciples, and probably everybody was trying to talk all at the same time, but they said, we have just come from the tomb. It is empty. Jesus' body is not there. And we saw an angel that said he is alive. Well, that's rather unbelievable to the disciples. They hadn't seen it, and they weren't going to believe it. But it's true. It's true, the women cried. We saw the angel ourselves, and he spoke to us. He told us that we would get to see Jesus. This is quite unfathomable to the disciples. They're having trouble believing it. But Peter had already heard the news from Mary Magdalene, and he had just taken off. John decided that he would take a look as well, and he followed Peter. Peter got a head start, but John was younger, and so John, being more agile and faster than Peter, caught up to him and got to the tomb first. And when he got there, he stood to the side and he looked in, but did not go into the tomb. Peter arrived after him, gasping for breath, and he went right in. And then John followed Peter into the tomb, and they took a look at the linen wrappings. They just floated down. They weren't disheveled. They weren't in a mess. And then they noticed the folded napkin as well. And so they couldn't think that the body had been stolen. What else could have happened? Well, John was convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead, and he believed. And then they went back to Jerusalem rejoicing that Jesus was not dead. Now, in the meantime, Mary Magdalene has been going back and forth, and she returns to the tomb. She doesn't meet the disciples, she doesn't meet Peter and John on the way, but she returns, and her heart is broken. She stood outside the tomb and was crying. She did not know the message. She did not know that angels had proclaimed Jesus was alive, and she was weeping. Jesus meant much to her. He had forgiven her many sins, and so she's not knowing what's going on here. She wept, then she stooped and looked inside the tomb, and there she saw two white-robed angels sitting, one at the head and one at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. And they asked her the question, "Why are you crying?" "Because they've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they have put him." And then she sensed that somebody was behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, and someone was there. Now, it was Jesus, but she was weeping, and she did not recognize him. And very gently, he asked, "Why are you crying? And for whom are you looking?" And Mary Magdalene thought that this was the gardener, a person that worked there. She thought maybe he was the one that had taken the body. And so she said, "Sir, if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and find him." And Jesus answered her with only one word. Much love and affection. He said, Mary. And she recognized that it was Jesus, and she fell at his feet. Master, are you really alive? Indeed he was. And Jesus said, go quickly and find my disciples. Tell them that I am going to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God. Now Mary, her weeping had turned to joy. She was overwhelmed. She was beside herself with joy. And she knew now that what the angel had said was true. She had seen Jesus herself. She had heard his voice. He was alive. He had risen from the dead. And she rushed back and told the disciples, I have seen the Lord. Now, it must have been a thrill, a great thrill to see the living Lord. Mary Magdalene was among the first to see Jesus after his resurrection. John had not seen Jesus, but he believed that Jesus was alive. Today, you and I have not seen him, but if we are Christians, if we believe, we certainly believe that he does live, risen from the dead.